And welcome to the fifth of 6 videos from the Roman Army lecture on logistics. Having done the little video on Vindolanda, and before that food in Lejeune, in this case I'm going to go big again and talk a little bit about the campaign side, preparing for war, and a little bit sort of changing course, talking a bit about the kind of information they might be gathering and that was available while they planned to go to war. Okay, the campaign side of this. All right. Okay, so here we go. Provincial administration. So obviously, this is still largely dealing with things in the imperial era. So less of our friend Pulo. He's like, why don't you love me? And more of my friend Polion, and to a lesser degree, Aemilianus. Okay. So obviously the emperors are the big decision makers, but we have governors who are responsible for making decisions for war making as well. And one of the things that they do or they get are these mandata, the mandates, which are detailed instructions sort of passed down in theory from governor to governor, which lays out some of the issues in the province and something to look out for. And then the new guy coming up would receive these and could ignore them or do whatever he wants to arrange things. Governors might be responsible for making arrangements with foreign powers. If they wanted to, that said, they wanted to obviously engage in a major military operation, they would need the emperor's permission. Although, if it's desperate times, might call for desperate measures. Now, right, so like the Romans obviously, when they were preparing for war, assuming they weren't caught out, they would rely on various kinds of information, including geographical information, and information about other people. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about in a second. In the next video, the last video, I'm going to take that and apply that using 2 different pieces of evidence, Hunts Perdianum and Vigedius. Okay, so a bit back to geography and itineraries. Whitaker wrote this sort of important book on frontiers, and then a sort of a collection of essays on it. Said, and here he is applying or referring specifically to the Romans and their worldview and their understanding of their environment. And he said that space itself was defined by itineraries, since it was through itineraries that Romans actually experienced space. That is, by lines and not by shapes. Remember what I showed you. Okay, so to give you an example of what's going on here. So when they're thinking about going to war, so they have their forts and their towers and their fortlets and so on the frontiers, along the rivers and major roads, etc., and in places where they can get food and supplies and more. But it seems that when it comes to figuring out which way to go, the maps they would use would be for the most part, a lot like this one. This is an illustration from the Peutinger table, sort of a famous for the late 4th century map, and a later copy of this, believed to be a late antique map. There's a lot of views about its purpose, ideology, express unity, etc. But it does, many would say, give a good idea of this itinerary-based worldview. So, where our maps might have places both in the immediate environment and beyond, depending how detailed you get, you might get various physical features, etc. These ones are more in terms of traveling from point A to point B along a straight line. And the parallel used, I don't have it here, is kind of like the subway maps that you get, okay, where you shows you how to get from station A to station B. Okay, maybe you need to go to station C and then change trains and go somewhere else. So you can see it's a bit like this here. We have larger places, okay, and this is the Balkans. Where did my cursor go? Like here, and the smaller ones, and you might change roads and go here. So I can tell you to get from this place to this place to this place, but then you have to veer off to go here. So going sort of in between these lines is a little more problematic. And you find the Danube River and various other things in and around this place. So when it comes to geography, another reason why it might be easier, not just for supply reasons, but also to campaign and move soldiers around with roads and rivers, is it fits quite well with their worldview to some degree. Now, the other part of this is, of course, they would need information about foreign people. And here is another good discussion of this from Harry Sidebottom, who I think I mentioned before. He's also wrote a bunch of historical novels about the Roman army, etc. And he notes, the frontier of the empire could be seen as a moral barrier. Inside were the arts, discipline, and humanity. Outside were wildness, irrationality, savagery, and barbarity. In large measure, the identity of a civilized member of the empire consisted in being the opposite of a barbarian, but there were tensions and ambiguities in Roman thinking. It was recognized that barbarians were not all the same. Those in the north were generally stupider, but more ferocious than those in the east. Some barbarians, northern or eastern, could be thought of as good and wise. Dio Chrysostom wrote up the Dacians as natural philosophers. So in some way, this gives you some idea of the general view of Romans on barbarians, on Roman people. Okay, a lot of bias, the words they use, how they describe them. We can see examples of this. And so not only is this help us understand a little bit about how they prepared for war, but the next lecture will be on enemies, so to speak, and there's so many things you can say about that. Okay, so we can find, for instance, if we jump ahead to Aemilianus's day, here he is. He's like, oh, it's me again. And we look at some of the writers writing in around his time and a bit later, develop these sort of sets of stereotypes that would be used to describe the various people. Some positive, some negative, but applied widely and not always critically. So we have, for instance, the jealousy of the Jews versus the Hebrews' foresight. We have the perfidy of the Persians constancy, the evasiveness of the Egyptians' ingenuity, the deceit of the Greeks' wisdom, the savagery of the Saracens. Some groups don't get the positives. The stupidity of the Saxons' perseverance, and so on. So a lot of these stereotypes inform what they knew about non-Roman people. And obviously, the less they knew and the less familiar they were, the more difficult it was. Just like the roads and geography. Obviously, you can move around and get to know things better if it's within your area than not. We get some of these kinds of views reflected in documents like the Vindolanda Tablets, where we see something like the Britons are unprotected by armor. There are very many cavalry. The cavalry do not use swords, nor do the wretched Britons mount in order to throw javelins. So some see this little quote from this little tablet as reinforcing some of those stereotypes and maybe implying that there were more notes of this sort in various military bases across the empire, only we don't have them, where they might make comments on what they sort of thought the people they might face were like, partially built on stereotypes, maybe depending on the circumstances, partially built upon observation and analysis, but hard to avoid given the educational background of most of the individuals. But anyway, there you get a hint that their information was, they had information about non-Roman people, they had information of geography, but a lot of stereotypes when it came to non-Roman people, and more itinerary-based geography. So the planning for war, would to some degree be limited by certain informational deficits.